Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. And good afternoon to our Honourable Minister, and lovely to be in your presence today. And as our Programme Director mentioned, we're going to be talking about tourism recovery. And in fact, the byline is actually making tourism matter. And I've got wonderful panellists today who are joining me on stage. And I'd like to start off, please, with welcoming to the stage Miss Akona Matsau, and she is the CEO of Bidvest Services in South Africa. So Akona, please join us on stage. Thank you. We have Mr. Martin Wiest, who's the CEO of Tourvest Destination Management. Martin. We have Mr. Elmar Conradie, who's the CEO of FlySafair. Elmar. And now the most difficult name for me to pronounce, Mr. Fouad, Caunhye, who is the regional manager of Qatar Airways. And he's probably going to, I hope he's going to rectify in terms of how to actually pronounce his name. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to be talking about the recovery and what we call making tourism matter. And I don't think we need to talk about making tourism matter because we know tourism matters. We've spoken about it, we've discussed it quite a lot this morning in terms of how important tourism is to our economy. What's really important now is actually making tourism matter in terms of growth. Because we obviously went through a very tough time. We are not back at where we were in 2019. In fact, if we look at our SADC numbers, and thank you to SADC for their very quick delivery of data in terms of numbers, and we know that in terms of our overall tourism numbers, although we're sitting at 106% of 2019, when it comes to overseas tourism, we're actually only sitting at 85%. So a lot of that is driven by African arrivals, and it's not driven by African air arrivals, because that is also sitting at around about 90% of what it was in 2019. So we're not back to where we need to be. And if you remember, those of you that were sitting in the room last year, we made a commitment of working to get to 15 million tourists by 2030. And that means we need a compound growth of 10% every year between now and 2030. We've never really achieved that yet. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So to make tourism matter, we need growth. So we're going to be talking today, and talking with our panelists in terms of where are we, and how do we get that growth? How do we get the growth that we so desperately need? So I'm going to start with Fouad because he brings the tourists into, or flies them in. I know we'll get to Martin in terms of, but let's talk about Qatar in terms of where is Qatar in terms of the recovery, and how do you see the outlook for tourism and for bringing people into South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Lian. And I'll talk a bit more about, the perspective from an industry, an international carrier industry perspective, rather than the Qatar one, and I'll mix it up with the Qatar experience as well. See, where are we now? We are dealing with booming markets. From a global perspective, those are booming markets. We're talking of flows that have resumed massively. Now, within that perspective, and I will not be too long at that, just to explain very simply, there has been a pre-globalization world and a post-globalization world. And from a bigger, a macro perspective, post-COVID have actually enhanced those movements, of post-globalization. So what has actually happened in the total throughput? You know what? Airline people, like to sound intelligent and talk about complexities, etc. At the end of the day, Elmar, myself, we do a very simple job, and we look at very simple dynamics. Pre-globalization, to be simplistic, we were dealing with flows that were immutable, that happened over time, over history, long periods. The world has gathered pace. In the old days, history, geography, colonial interfacing, etc., meant that you had a few points. that created critical mass around those flows. So one of those flows was Africa to UK, for instance, India to London, Australia, and Trans-Pacific, and so on. The world has become smaller, in the dynamics that we deal with, the things that remain the same are distance, the cost of flying over distance, and the revenue made from selling a ticket. So at X price over the longest distance, there's a factor that we use for measurement that is called yield that we look at. So the longer the distance, the higher the cost of operations, the inputs being oil, cost of fuel, etc., leasing of aircraft, etc., means that we end up with the lowest yield. So what airlines end up doing, the long short of it is that what airlines end up doing is, on a global selection of routes, look for the route that provides the higher yield. And this is where we sit. We are not blessed by distance in our ecosystem. We are dealing with factors of currency, which the longer flown the distance, the lower the yield, and basically we're fighting an uphill. Where let's say in a post-globalized world, and now talking about the Qatar experience, but also building around it a little bit around the Middle Eastern experience globally in general, and that leaf having been borrowed, if you want, from a very small country, very small state called Singapore in the 80s and 90s, which was the first one who started building that tourism ecosystem around its hub, and engaging it around the airline or its national carrier. So you would see that there has been massive investment in the UAE, massive investment in Qatar, there's coming massive investment in Saudi Arabia, and this is simply for the purpose of designing a critical mass ecosystem to provide for long flows. And this is, it's a perspective of go big or go bust. Maybe that is something that we might want to think about over here, where it will also mean, and again to be simplistic, you would look at those countries, from point of view of not their GDP, but the transmission rate of their economies into these ecosystems. Singapore's GDP is one of the highest in the world after Switzerland, $90,000 per capita. The US, I think, runs at around 70,000, UK around 65, and then we are here in South Africa with a GDP throughput of around 7,000. We are stepped up by a small country like Mauritius. We are with around 9,000. Now, what does it mean for these airlines from these countries is that either we go big or we condemn to remain small. And this has a massive impact on tourism. So maybe one idea would be to have a critical strategy around tourism where we need to think across borders of not only private sector and public sector, but also maybe along the lines of inter-party, inter-political borders, because it's somebody mentioned earlier, it's the one bridge that can link to our 65% youth unemployment. It's that one bridge that can link to developing a country and ensuring that all those sectors work together. I think I've spoken long enough. Thanks for the opportunity, Liane.
So it's about collaboration, economic collaboration and geographic collaboration as well to really make it work.
It's the basics. You go to the ABCD, and that's what it is. Critical mass ensures that there's continuity, that the sector is critical, but it's not the only one that determines the scale or the scope of your country. The Middle Eastern countries have had, what they're doing today has not been a decision of yesterday, it's been a decision of 10 or 15 years back. And every building block has linked up to creating a self-reinforcing system.
So, but in terms of your frequencies and your capacity that you've got flying into South Africa, are you back at 2019 levels?
Absolutely. We're back to our 2019 levels. I think most airlines are back to normal internationally on South Africa. And yes, South Africa remains a desirable destination globally. There's points, and we're talking about this inter-party, inter-geography, inter-province. There's points about mixing, you know, all stakeholders, your municipalities, your provincial governments, you know, etc., to make sure that the country is a total seller. Because I will not hide it, most of the inbound demand throughput into South Africa goes further down south to Cape Town. Joburg is mainly business, and it's still valuable for the moment, but there's also some challenges with regards to the yield element and how much currency value an airline is able to extract. You extract into Cape Town with people flying in because they're selling into harder currencies, but you're not extracting out with a rand selling close to 20 rands to the dollar.
Thank you. Elmar, let's talk then around SAFair in terms of your recovery. Where are you at? And are you sort of seeing sort of similar levels to what Fouad is saying?
I'll start with the domestic market as a whole. What we're seeing as passenger numbers domestically is back to about 81%. If I look at the first 7 months of this year versus the first 7 months of last year. In terms of pre-COVID, it's also about at that level. It's at 80%, and international travel also recovered to about 80%, which is a big recovery from last year. International travel was still last year only at about 56%. So I think international travel year on year grew something like 47%, which is massive, but still below 2019 levels. For us as a company, we're in a sort of strange situation that we're way beyond the 2019 levels, just because there was such a massive change in the structure of the market. Last year when I was sitting here, I got a lot of grief from the participants in this room because they said, your yields are so high, and what are you going to do to get yields down, and price tickets are so high. And I said, wait, you'll see what will happen. I mean, we brought 14 aircraft in 14 months, and the yields are now 15% lower than a year ago. It's still higher than pre-COVID, but I don't think it's a factor of capacity so much anymore. It's now input costs. It's airlines are facing, especially South African airlines, the weaker exchange rate, the fuel price hasn't gone down to the levels that we would like to see it at. And then something that the whole aviation industry is facing at the moment is massive increases in input costs, specifically component costs. All the materials, which are normally in dollar denominated, has been going up by 12, 13, 14%, which is unheard of, which puts a lot of pressure on us and therefore on the ticket prices.
So you talk about input costs, and that's something that came out in the Tourism Business Index, and that's something that tourism businesses, whether they're in the accommodation sector or outside of it, it's one of the real challenges that they're facing at the moment. So we can understand the airline industry, obviously reliant on imported product as well, really gets impacted. But it's and your fleet, has that increased?
Yeah, so we've increased our fleet. We've got a total of 34 aircraft now. So pre-COVID, we were on about 21, I think. So it's been a massive increase since then.
And routes?
Routes, we've added 1 or 2 since COVID. We've added Joburg, Bloemfontein. We've recently added Cape Town, George. We actually added Durban, Lanseria in this period that we didn't actually fly before, so that was actually a new route for us. And then we started flying internationally. We're now flying to Mauritius, to Zanzibar, and from the beginning of October, we'll be flying to 4 of the neighboring countries. We'll be flying to Maputo, Vic Falls, Livingston, and Harare.
Excellent. That's excellent. Thank you. Martin, let's go to you. How's Tourvest doing in terms of, from an inbound perspective?
Yeah, to us, it's, I guess we're a reflection of the overall market. Different market segments have come back at different speeds. The 4 to 5 star segment has come back quicker and more completely than the 3-star volume market. I guess our numbers currently show that we're trading at about 70% of 2019 levels in South Africa. And I think that's what I want to highlight. What COVID has done, it's sort of done Control-Alt-Delete, and then tourism redistributed itself when people started traveling again. And what we certainly see, and we're privileged to the numbers because we trade in many constituencies in Africa, our Kenyan business, our Tanzanian business, our Zanzibar business, interestingly enough, has recovered materially faster than South Africa. But in all of those environments, we trade about 20% higher than pre-COVID levels. Namibia and South Africa is trading below 2019 levels. Botswana is more or less on par. And I think that's really, really relevant to identify what is the difference between those destinations in South Africa, because that will lead us to the right conclusions in terms of what we have to do to accelerate the recovery in South Africa. And my friend from Qatar takes a very different view than I do. His view is we have to have consistent high volumes to South Africa in order to achieve a consistent load factor and yield for the airlines, which makes it sustainable, and they deploy aircrafts onto the route. And if I was an airline, I would take exactly the same view. However, it's interdependent, and it becomes a chicken and the egg situation, because we can only have consistent high volumes of tourists into a country if we have low airfares and poor yields on behalf of the airlines. And so it takes two to tango to make this industry happen again. And then there's different aspects from an overall tourism industry, because tourism is not rocket science. It really is not. Like you said, airliners make it unnecessarily complicated. We need a destination that works and that is safe. And by the way, my pet hate is it needs to be clean, and South Africa is becoming increasingly dirty. Honorable Minister Auntie Pat said earlier on, we live in one of the most beautiful countries on the planet. But we need to get our litter and our rubbish under control in this country, because it doesn't make it pretty as a departure point. We need to have an infrastructure that works where the blue train doesn't arrive in Cape Town 2 days late because Transnet doesn't have rails any longer. And we need an overall experience in a country that works, and South Africa has all the aspects that can make it work. We need capacity on the inbound side with the airlines in order to bring airfares down. I mean, I said it earlier on, average guest of ours in 2019 paid 600 euros to get to South Africa, now it's 1,500 euros. It's a material difference. We need to drive demand, so we need to have a working tourism marketing organization, because that is the only thing that will drive demand. And then we need to have capacity skills in the country, and we talked about special skills permits, etc. here, and then we can build this tourism. It's a total puzzle. In order to make it a beautiful picture, we need to have all the puzzle pieces, and currently there's puzzle pieces missing.
It does sound depressing, Martin, but we'll get into a little bit just now.
I'm anything but depressed. I'm a happy-go-lucky chappy, but there's work to be done. It's not a self-runner. You know, we can't pat ourselves on the shoulders. There's work to be done.
Akona, let's go to you. Let's hear about what's happening at Bidvest, and I know that you've got your fingers in a number of little subsectors of the tourism industry. Can you tell us about how each of them are performing, and give us some insights?
Thank you very much, Leanne. I think our performance certainly in the tourism sector is reflective of two things. One, where our geographic exposure sits. As we all know, there are certain geographies that seem to have recovered quicker than others. And secondly, also the subsets in terms of the markets that we serve, where those are sitting. We are fortunate enough in that, from an inbound perspective, our exposure is predominantly the Northern American market, and a significant part of Europe and UK, etc. And that market And it's also coincidentally that in that market, we tend to be in the 4.5 and 5-star segment, and that market has rebounded beautifully. In fact, better than we could have expected. What we are seeing is that the 3-star, etc. market has been slow to recover, and I suppose that could be expected with the state of the global economy where it is. From a business travel perspective, while it has recovered, what we are seeing is that the work from home phenomena is impacting on business travel. And so what we've seen a significant rebound in is the MICE and conferencing and business sector of that market. And interestingly, the leisure market, the domestic leisure market, seems to have done very well, particularly in that kind of self-drive space, in the lodges space, etc. So our view of recovery, we're certainly not at, in the overall basket, we are certainly not at 2019 levels, but there are certain subsectors within that basket that have purely, strictly outperformed the 2019 levels. So, yeah.
Martin, you were talking about other African countries that are performing better. What are they doing? What can we learn from them?
So if I take our big 4 trading areas from a Tourvest perspective, so Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya is our biggest 4 trading environments on the DMC side. South Africa has historically always been 70% of our, it's our home turf, it's our home, it's our passion. And after all, we are a patriotically South African company. It's in the meantime, in our environment, become about, for my division, not for Tourvest overall, at about 35% of total turnover, whilst the others have grown disproportionately. In my view, they're doing 2 things differently. The fact that they had different policy on how to get themselves through COVID certainly still has a hangover. You know, remember Tanzania never had COVID, so somehow or another that is ignored in the world space these days. It certainly has grown air capacity quicker. The airfares are, of course, lower because it's a shorter distance from the core source markets. So, and hence why my conclusion is that, yes, South Africa has a marketing problem, yes, South Africa has a reputational problem, but you know, Kenya and Tanzania is not exactly humdingingly without its problems either. So to me, the key logic at the moment is that it's a exposure and demand drive topic, and secondly, a access to destination topic, which is capacity and price.
Akona, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with that. I mean, 2 other markets in the continent that seem to have recovered much better than South Africa is Egypt and Morocco. And if you look at a kind of a globally also, the UAE has recovered way past the 2019 levels. And one of the things that is quite evident is obviously what were the COVID protocols that existed in those markets, how quickly those markets opened up post-COVID, and of course it's access and distance from your major markets, which talks to airline availability and also affordability for those routes. So certainly it makes a big impact.
So, Fouad, how do we overcome that big, distance is a set, we can't change distance. It is what it is. How do we really grow the number of people that fly into South Africa, whether it's for business purposes, whether it's for leisure purposes? What do we do and what do we do differently?
See, Liane, airlines will look at profitability. That is, you know, the most demurring factor, you know, and that will remain. They also look, when doing that, they also look, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk like an economist, but those are fundamentals of business we look at. The other thing that we also look at is the demand curve when linked to tourism, for instance, or any other products. The demand curve we face on a country, a destination, a point. One of the reasons For instance, that north-north flow is much higher than the north-south flow right now, is that you have a more diversified product, a more disseminated type of product. The demand curve, the tourism demand curve facing South Africa or faced by South Africa is that it's very cluttered at the top, very high-level products, and good investment, by the way, in lodges, in five-star hotels, five-star properties, etc. And then you have a kind of a broad 2 to 1-star product range at the bottom. The B&Bs and the smaller hotels, not to name anyone in particular. There are huge gaps along the curve that we are not occupying. And that explains why, for instance, right now, airlines like Qatar and other airlines are putting more capacity on points like Thailand, like Indonesia, or even the Mediterranean, simply because of the fact that you face year-round conditions and you face multi-segment demand conditions all the time. As long as South Africa remains within that very seasonal keg that we face, we will be condemned to specific product types. Let's build along the demand curve and diversify, diversify, and diversify.
So it's driving consistent demand and finding that missing middle type of tourists, making sure that we fill the whole spectrum. And
your
consistently.
Your 2-star plus, your 3-star plus, your 3 and 3/4 star type of product along the range. Very good 5-star products, but that only attracts one type of demand.
So we need to develop, promote that sort of the more mid-market type of product and get those more mid-market tourists to come here. The bulk of the market.
There's a reason Australians invade Bali, at one time of the year. You have everything ranging from 6, 7 down to 1 star.
But then realistically, the cost of the flight from an overseas perspective, is it not too expensive for that market? Are we not too expensive for that market to come here?
Airlines don't work with only one price. As long as there's a mix. To be simplistic, airlines, and I'm sure the Honourable Minister would like hearing that, airlines are not determined to join the fray in overcompeting in the South African market. What airlines want to do is to bring in people who pay higher currencies on higher values. So as long as we provide them with a product, they will be coming, like they do in Thailand, like they do in the Mediterranean, Santorini, Mykonos, etc., etc. Globalization is a factor. Whereas long ago we used to use those long fields and long flows, now Europe remains, and that's reality, Europe remains 60% of the global tourism source market of the world. But now they fly shorter. They fly to points in the Mediterranean. How do we attract them here is by giving them a product that will bring them over.
Elmar, let's go to you. In terms of what are the levers that you need to really grow your business?
I think, obviously the strange thing is that transport's not really tourism, but we're heavily reliant on the tourism business, and I think to a big extent more than ever before. What we're seeing is similar to what the other panelists said, is that business travel is not exactly back to normal. There is business travel, there is conferences, all of this stuff happens, but we're more reliant now than ever on leisure and tourist travel. The problem with that is that the tourist and the leisure travel is dependent on so many other factors. If you look at domestic travel, they are heavily dependent on the state of the economy, feeling safe, ticket prices. And if I can quickly say something on that, because it seems like that's a popular topic, is that aviation or transport tickets is one of those strange things that the more demand there is, the cheaper it actually gets to fly. Because if you don't have a lot of demand on a route or to a particular destination, the airline, whoever flies there, will put a small gauge aeroplane on there, maybe a few seats, and those ticket prices will be extremely high. Then as the demand grows, they'll put a bigger gauge and a bigger gauge and a bigger gauge aeroplane. And that actually drives the prices down. So if we want lower ticket prices, we need to get more people to want to fly here. Then the ticket prices will come down automatically. But in short, we're heavily dependent. I think tourism is sort of the last little bit of the economy that is the engine for growth. But it's not the starter. We need the fundamentals in the rest of the economy to fire. You know, people need to. I was actually encouraged by everything that was identified this morning. It's like, I think we all know what we need to do. We all talk the whole time about the same things. It's safety, security, visas. We need to get those basics to work 100%, and then I think the tourism industry will fly.
Do you think your business has benefited from the infrastructure challenges that we're facing in the country? So the fact that we don't have a proper rail system, our roads in certain areas are not in a good state?
I don't think we've got enough time to discuss that. I can just say that we certainly would have had some benefit out of that, maybe from a leisure travel point of view. But we've got our own challenges that we face because of infrastructure challenges. I think it was in the press last year a few times about some of the fuel shortages. This year, the fuel shortages haven't been completely sorted out. There were a few times where we were desperately close to not having enough fuel to fly. So infrastructure challenges, I think, affects everybody. So I don't think there's one particular sector that benefits out of it, because in the end, they also suffer because of other issues.
So Martin, we've got the ear of the minister here. What policy changes or new policies do we need? What policies do we need altered quite significantly in order to grow tourism? That's going to help your business.
I think it's, I mean, I believe we have a green paper now. I didn't know that. I read the white paper still when it was around. I think we've got all the policies that we need to have a successful tourism industry. I think we have a wonderful policy framework in this country. Apart from having an amazing destination, despite some of the shortfalls infrastructurally, in my job, I'm privileged to have traveled to over 80 countries on the planet, and South Africa is still absolutely my favorite. If I had to choose a holiday destination, I would choose South Africa. And the policy framework is right. I think where we must improve is the implementation of the policy framework. I don't think we need to change much. I mean, if it was up to me, I would have open skies in South Africa in order to entice more people to fly here more frequently, because we no longer have a national carrier to protect in terms of route. And if I followed the conversation earlier, reciprocal agreements, and I fly to you if you fly to me, and that type of stuff. And I think maybe that would make it easier, but not an expert. I'm not an expert in that subject. But I don't think we need to change much. We need to implement better of what we have. And then I think we are in a much better position to drive the growth in the tourism industry.
Okay, let's just talk quickly about some of the issues that were identified in the Tourism Business Index, the impediments to growth. So for what I want to call the non-accommodation sector, so the TBI is divided into the accommodation and the rest of the tourism industry. The biggest challenges around safety and were identified as safety and security, shortage of skilled staff. Seems to be a big issue. Even though, on a positive note, many businesses are looking to employ new staff, looking forward into the next half of the year, which is great. But there seems to be a big issue around skill shortages. Are you all feeling that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think so. So thanks, Leanne. I think if I can start around the safety and security issue, and to just maybe echo some of my colleagues' comments around policy framework, etc. I don't think this country needs more policies. I think what we really need to do is to pay more attention around a coordinated effort of making sure that the things that are not working are done properly. From a safety and security element, I think it is encouraging that both public sector and private sector have now come together in this industry initiative to make sure that we improve safety and security. There is obviously a lot of work that we can still do to create safety corridors. And there's great examples of where that has been done. If you think back about a year or so ago, we had an issue around the Kruger National Park where there was concerns around safety. And actually what has kind of resolved that to a great extent is the public and private partnership that has ensured that there is stability in that corridor. Around skills, I think one of the heartbreaking things in terms of the tourism industry is that it is an industry that was absolutely battered by COVID. And what that has resulted in is a lot of trauma, where a lot of people have decided that if they are to maintain livelihoods for their families and for themselves, they need to find an industry that can provide more predictable type of employment. And the challenge to all of us, one as the industry, but also as policymakers, is to kind of figure out, how do we build better going forward? How do we create an industry that has some form of security, social security net? And how do we think about equitable distribution of some of the gains that come out of that industry? Because that's the only thing that's really going to attract and keep people back in the industry.
If I may add, maybe from our perspective, I think it's the big companies that have the financial means to train and educate must do that. I mean, at Tourvest we take in 500 learners and interns every single year. Funnily enough, we retain over 90% of them into permanent employment. Because the tertiary educations are still not training tourism per se, unfortunately, because the curriculums are not aligned to inbound tourism, the curriculums are aligned to outbound tourism. I think you're being called to order. It says 37 seconds, and this one says time up, so I think you're in trouble. I think industry must participate in the training of people, number one. And then secondly, and I think it's as important, where we have temporary skills shortages at the moment, we must be able, and I was very excited to hear from the Minister of Home Affairs this morning that there's progress, we must be able to temporarily import skills to plug the hole at the moment, but simultaneously train South Africans to fill those holes in the future so that we create sustainable employment and a change of the socio-economic system in South Africa in the long term.
And make it an attractive industry that they want to be in and want to stay in.
It's a killer industry for starters. I mean, I wouldn't leave this industry.
You wouldn't?
I would never.
When the bug is bitten, it's bitten. Thank you very much to the panelists. I hope you've all enjoyed the very insightful discussion. I think to me what is quite clear is the collaboration, communication, the positive attitude of actually working together, public-private sector working together. I really do believe that we can make this happen. We can get the growth that we need. We're on the right path. Let's keep working at it. There's still a lot to be done. And we have to acknowledge that. We've acknowledged some of the issues that we're facing, but it's something that we can do. We can get to that number of 15 million. We can get the 10% growth. Not too certain. If we work at it, it's not going to be easy. But it's something that we all need to put our heads down and actually work together to actually make it happen. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause, please, for the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.